This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, I'm standing in for Siobhan O'Sullivan, and both Siobhan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, that's A-A-S-A. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. You can join for $60 Australian if you're a waged academic and only $15 Australian if you're unwaged, including students and those who are precariously waged. ASA does lots of great things to support the animal studies community worldwide. For example, they publish Animal Studies Journal, which is one of the few academic journals in the discipline. If you work in animal studies, why don't you consider submitting something? This episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series. This is a series from Sydney University Press focused on animal studies. On 1st of October, the latest book in the series was published. That's Meatsplaining, the Animal Agriculture Industry and the Rhetoric of Denial, which was edited by Jason Hannon. It explores the rhetorical strategies used by the animal agriculture industry to avoid addressing the fact that it perpetrates harms on animals and damages the environment. Let me quote briefly from the blurb. What strategies does the industry use to avoid questions about its inhumane treatment of animals and its impact on the environment and public health? What narratives, myths, and fantasies does it promote to sustain its image in the public imagination? If that kind of thing sounds interesting to you, it certainly sounds interesting to me, you could consider ordering a copy, approaching a journal about publishing a review, or asking your university library to order the book for you. This week, we're joined by Dr Emelia Quinn. Amelia is a lecturer in the English Language and Culture Group in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Amsterdam. And you may know her as one of the editors of the Palgrave Macmillan collection, Thinking Veganism in Literature and Culture. Long-time listeners of Knowing Animals will perhaps recall that we previously interviewed both Anat Pick and Bob Mackay about their respective chapters in that book here on the podcast. Today, however, I'm going to be talking to Amelia about her paper Vegan Camp, which was published just a few weeks ago in the October issue of PMLA, which is the Journal of the Modern Language Association. Welcome to the podcast, Amelia.
Thanks, Josh.
So, can you start by telling us what inspired you to write this paper?
Sure, yeah. So, I was actually invited to a whaling conference at the Whole Maritime Museum by an old supervisor of mine who I think strongly believes in my ability to cross disciplines. And the idea with this conference was that you could have just picked an object. He was bringing kind of J.M.W. Turner's whaling paintings to the Whole Maritime Museum and displaying them alongside a bunch of local whaling art from Hull was a big whaling port in the 19th century. And the idea, I think, is you picked an object from the collection and spoke about it. And I think the reason Jason invited me as a literature scholar with very little background in art is because he wanted a vegan perspective, that he didn't want this to just be only about art, but there was a reflection on the whaling industry itself from a kind of critical animal studies viewpoint. And I found this super difficult because, one, I was super uncomfortable about my ability to talk about art, but also I didn't really know what to say that would be interesting, kind of other than, oh, well, this image is obviously bad, it's a legacy of atrocity, it represents death, full stop. That kind of anxiety about what Richard Twine calls a vegan killjoy position that, just condemn the entire exhibition. But that all changed as I was kind of scrolling through the images, just desperately trying to think of something to write about. I found the image that you can see in the article, and it totally kind of I guess took me back because it seemed to be just this incredibly kitschy object. So it's a piece of scrimshaw, so whale tooth, with this kind of very gaudy image of an adolescent sailor with a big cannon between his legs, waving a British flag. And I just thought it was so fun, and I kind of smiled upon seeing it and really enjoyed it. And then, I was starting to think about what I was meant to do with that pleasure, that it was a kind of genuine aesthetic pleasure and delight that I was getting from this object that ostensibly was the remains of a dead, slaughtered whale. And so then the article emerged about thinking about theorizing pleasure and actually what is available to vegans other than straightforward renunciation or kind of denial of enjoyment, and how we might think more seriously and critically about pleasure. And so Vegan Camp is an attempt to come to terms with that and offer something for vegans where we can kind of acknowledge aesthetic delight while also being aware of a certain, how that makes us complicit in violence and offering, I guess, just a different lens.
So did you find that a kind of hostile environment, a conference on whaling?
No, I mean, I think, Jason is an animal studies and pro-vegan scholar himself, so I think that the atmosphere was nice. I mean, the awkward thing is that he kind of put me on this Scrimshaw panel where the girl before me did an excellent paper on how Scrimshaw was a legacy of atrocity. So I think the contrast there, where I then stood up and said, no, it's very funny and enjoyable, was difficult to deal with. But I think, it's that kind of binarizing that is interesting to think about as both being valid and both kind of as nuancing the range of perspectives available.
So your response to this piece of art was to come up with and develop this idea of a vegan camp aesthetic. Could you try and summarize for listeners what this idea of the vegan camp is?
Yeah, so it draws obviously on camp as an existing, I guess, aesthetic or affective response in queer theory, as kind of Susan Sontag famously theorizes, as a kind of appreciation of surface, a kind of reveling in playing a role, and as a joy that is a kind of community that is built from kind of the kitschy and the ostensibly bad, a refusal to see depth, and vegan camp builds on this in kind of, rather than seeking to, I guess, go along the lines of a conventional narrative that we find in much animal studies of always having to expose violence, of always kind of recovering the absent referent animal, making the walls of the slaughterhouse invisible so we can see what goes on underneath. Vegan camp is about a different narrative of refusing this kind of constant exposure to violence and instead seeking pleasure. And what that amounts to in my paper here is that kind of seeing these objects of exploitation as kind of kitschy spectacles of human exceptionalism, that they provide us with a way of gaining vegan community from kind of not taking too seriously. So it's this I get an aspiration that these products don't harm us or don't harm animals, but provide us with some sort of sustenance that we see the world around us as kind of in some way silly. But at the same time, it performs complicity. I think one of the issues that certainly people would say about veganism is that it's this association with just moral purity, the beautiful soul that doesn't acknowledge complicity, whereas laughing through vegan camp, finding pleasure, is in itself performing a kind of complicity, that we are guilty of enjoying these consumer products. And that, I think, is really important and key too, in that how it kind of helps us to deal with and perform complicity and acknowledge that in some way.
Could I ask you to expand a bit on what you mean by performing complicity? What are you talking about? Complicity with what? And what does it mean to perform it?
Yeah, it's a great question, Josh. I think for me, as I've always tried to theorize veganism, I mean, that's what my work in general does, is thinking about veganism as a state of insufficiency, that veganism, by its very kind of nature, by the way we live in the world, is impossible to fully achieve, right? We're never going to be successfully 100% vegan, and that acknowledging that is a really important part of coming to grips with a kind of far more nuanced and helpful idea of veganism as a kind of striving rather than a successfully arrived at position. And so part of that is a complicity with systems of exploitation, that just through consuming things from the supermarket, just by living in kind of Western capitalist culture, we are of course contributing in some way to exploitation. And so with vegan camp, the kind of the act of laughing, the act of enjoying, or the act of I hope one day of kind of performing a kind of drag act that just plays with and makes fun of I don't know, sausages and leather, that you are therefore kind of performing a kind of enjoyment, and that enjoyment is itself signaling kind of, I guess, some form of awareness of your implication within these broader structures of violence.
I see. I'm intrigued by this image of the drag act
Mm.
because that very strongly brings to mind what you call in the article queer camp,
Hmm.
which is, I think, what lots of people would think of when they think about and talk about camp culture. So, what do you see as the relationship between vegan camp and queer camp?
Yeah, I think that's really important to note, because obviously you don't want to be at risk of just kind of appropriating and taking a concept that exists within a very specific subculture and a very specific kind of historical moment for that kind of community, and just apply it for your own needs. But for me, vegan camp is an extension of queer camp, in that, queer camp is often about dismantling and challenging and kind of refusing to take seriously heteronormative expectations, certain ideas of masculinity. And vegan camp is also involved in that, right? As we know from Carol Adams's work, the act of eating meat is kind of implicitly or explicitly even engaged in this kind of construction of certain ideas of masculinity, and so vegan camp is, seeking to ridicule or kind of to satirize that kind of link between human exceptionalism and ideas of masculinity and heteronormativity. And at the same time, I think veganism, by seeking to, I guess, extend the level of kinship, it is doing similar things to queer theory and its desire to kind of look beyond the kind of family environment as the locus of kinship structures. But I think throughout the article, I draw other parallels. So, some of, if obviously Sedgwick's work provides kind of a really key theoretical framework for the article, but even some of Tim Dean's work on impersonality. So he writes really kind of beautifully on impersonal ethics within queer sex, and I think that comes to play a big role in vegan camp, in that vegan camp isn't really about animals, right? It's about vegans, and that's a big difference. Whereas queer camp is kind of for gay men, about gay men, vegan camp is about vegans and seems to therefore ignore animals. But if we think about this as a kind of productive impersonality or distance, then we gain something more from that kind of, it's a kind of letting animals be. I think I'm now kind of rambling completely off topic, but I think there's other ways in which queer drag, it seems to invite these vegan readings, right? You have big plastic feather boas and PVC. There was a famous I think so, a Georgia-based drag act, maybe, that her whole act revolves around these kind of little Vienna sausages made of kind of 3 different types of meat. And so I think all these kind of aesthetics that are kind of key to these drag cultures do seem to offer something to vegan camp, and that relationship is important.
That's very interesting. And I think it's particularly interesting, this distinction you draw between queer camp being performed by and being about gay men, and then vegan camp being performed by and being about vegans. But is there not a danger in making this about vegans when really we should be making it about the animals?
100%, and I think it's a really fair critique. But what I try and establish in my argument is that that's the exact kind of danger I want to revel in, both as it goes into the idea we were talking about before of a complicity, and that it's this acknowledgement of kind of actually disregarding the animals that veganism risks. But that it's also about, I guess, acknowledging that distance, right? Kind of to think in kind of Derrida's famous formulation, in that, we really can't ever speak for animals without kind of erasing them in some way, erasing their otherness. And so we need to acknowledge that distance. And so vegan camp is one way of kind of almost performing that distance of the distance between the human and the animal, and taking something beneficial from that distance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. I'd like to ask a little bit about stereotypes of vegans, because one of the things from reading your article that jumped out was the way that you argue that stereotypes of vegans can become kind of political, and vegan camp, well, both queer camp and vegan camp play upon stereotypes, but vegan camp plays upon the stereotype of, for example, the vegan who secretly desires meat. especially the female vegan who secretly desires meat. So could you explain how it is that playing on these stereotypes can become a kind of form of political critique?
Yeah, so the one you mentioned there is I draw out from Annie Potts and Jovian Parry's analysis of the kind of media responses to vegan sexuality, and this idea that veganism is this kind of women's identity in which they want to sleep with other vegans simply because they're kind of repressing their desire for meat and penis, as kind of almost conflated in that sense. And so I guess I bring that up in the article to think that what a vegan drag might look like is a kind of archetypally repressed vegan woman coming out and just kind of rabidly desiring products of exploitation, and oh god, why and so why I think that can be political is because it's so absurd, right? It's performing to excess this idea of, oh god, I desperately need meat and men, and that that by making it absurd, by overblowing, by exaggerating it, by suggesting that vegans so desperately want meat, it ends up parodying or satirizing kind of a mainstream culture in which this obsession with meat, with needing meat and desiring meat, is itself something to be held up to scrutiny. And so I guess the politicization here is kind of satirizing our culture's kind of almost, well, not almost, a completely obsessive desire to constantly be naturalizing our relationship to eating animals, and to always having to be reinforcing it. I mean, to go back to the scrimshaw, this idea that killing a whale and dismembering its teeth isn't enough. You also have to carve a big man with a cannon between his legs on it also, right? That is, it's this spectacle of just like, why you have to try so hard?
Yes. From one spectacle to another, one of your examples is Lady Gaga's famous meat dress. And you try to think about and look at that through a kind of camp lens. What do you see? What's the campness of this object?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when I've kind of this is paper, I guess it's been 3 years in the workings, and so I've presented it at a lot of conferences, and the Gaga dress is often a fairly contentious example, particularly among vegan audiences. They're like, oh no, but this is real animal bodies and it's in the present, and so therefore it's condemnable and you can't salvage it for camp. But for me, I think what's most interesting, and what I guess the conclusion I come to in the discussion of the dress in the article, is that no one really knows what Gaga's dress is about. She tries to link it in some way to the don't ask, don't tell policy and gay rights, but it doesn't seem to really do that. It doesn't really seem to do anything for vegetarianism or veganism. There's all these conflicting narratives, but then there's this constant obsession in news reports around it that they don't really know what it means, and kind of, what if the joke is on us? And so I think what's interesting here is that meat as this is reduced to pure kind of surface in Gaga, and meanings kind of refuse to stick to it. We're so used to kind of meat having these solid, secure meanings. It means masculinity, it means strength, it means, human triumph. But this kind of surface of meat with Gaga kind of rejects all meaning. It refuses to be anything but surface. And that, I think, is really key to a vegan camp position of kind of meat as just pure surface. And that sense kind of almost satirizing this kind of anxiety about always applying meaning, about making it something more.
So by surface, you mean that it is exactly what it looks like. There's no deep meaning to it.
Exactly, kind of, at surface as a kind of literal kind of material present.
I see. So you end the article on what struck me, and by the way, I encourage every listener to read this article. One of the things I absolutely love about this sort of work is just how much fun it is. The way you can draw together all these seemingly completely different examples to provide kind of vegan readings or potential vegan openings. But one of the kind of surprising things about the article is the way that you finish it. And essentially, you seem to say, you're interested in this prospect of a kind of vegan camp aesthetic, but you yourself are often drawn much more to the more typical vegan kind of concern with exposing suffering and exposing the kind of lived realities of animals. So would it be fair to say that although you although you've exposed this possibility of a vegan camp, you are not a kind of wholehearted supporter of the possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think what is key. I mean, I think that's right to draw out in that definitely violence it is traumatizing to me. Thinking about what happens to animals is something I find, deeply difficult to handle. And vegan camp is almost an aspiration that there might be a way we can we can seek pleasure. But I think what's key to know also is that when I propose vegan camp, I'm not suggesting that it's this universally applicable concept that can be put on all distressing situations of that's camp now, but that it's a different possibility, and that for some situations it works well. So when we're talking about mock meats where there's not that kind of direct site of kind of traumatic confrontation with violence, that vegans really can enjoy the spectacle of mock meats as this kind of reveling in the kind of absurdity of, in the article I bring out the kind of mock plucked, mock duck, mock meat, and how, the absurdity of that, of the kind of fleshiness, is a situation in which I think I can enjoy vegan camp. Or, I've been thinking about this a lot. And so I went to a Jeff Koons exhibit with a friend of mine, and the work of art, what's it called? Ushering in Banality, where he kind of blows up this kind of kitschy statue of three kind of angelic little children pushing a pig along. And I think that is a kind of really nice vegan camp piece of kind of this kind of super kitschy, overblown status of our kind of paradoxical sentimentalization of animals and their relation to childhood. So there definitely are scenes in which I think vegan camp is something that makes sense to me. But yeah, I think it's difficult to escape horror. And I don't think we should strive to completely mute or erase those responses, but that we can have them in addition to other responses.
So would it be fair to say that vegan camp could perhaps become a tool in our arsenal, or would that be to kind of trivialize it?
No, I think that's exactly right, Josh. A kind of tool, or kind of just a way of more accurately theorizing our specific reactions in specific situations, right? To go back to the scrimshaw, my response wasn't renunciation, it wasn't disgust. And rather than try and kind of artificially say I'm disgusted, try and do something with that pleasure that is productive, and try and recognize where it's coming from and what it can be used for. And in this sense, I think it's to kind of create a sense of vegan community and a sense of what I say in the article as a kind of vegan survival strategy, in that as vegans or as people who kind of support animal rights, confronting violence every day can be super traumatizing and also super paralyzing, and kind of prohibits our ability to make action. And so having some sort of framework for understanding and valuing pleasure is important.
I think that's a really thoughtful, positive note when thinking about this particular article. And perhaps to move on to the 5 quick questions that we ask every guest.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Excellent. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yeah, I mean, I did MA at York several years ago now, where we did one class on animal studies. And I think for that we read in combination kind of Haraway, Deleuze-Guattari, and Derrida. But I think maybe even before we had that class, just seeing the term animal studies on a syllabus, and I was like, oh my God, I never thought that I could write about animals. And went and read Carol J. Adams' Sexual Politics of Meat. And, that's the one I remember reading with the most kind of visceral kind of enthusiasm that completely changed the direction of my scholarship from that day forward.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, so for part of that MA, kind of after doing that course, I wrote a piece on veganism and rom-coms, so in Hollywood cinema. So I looked at Legally Blonde 2, and I think that is now published as an article, but I won't promote it too much because I think at some point it just needs to fade into insignificance. But that was the first piece I wrote. It was something about kind of how vegans were replacing queers as kind of objects of comic relief in the Hollywood rom-com.
Oh, good. But so it is in a similar kind of theme to the present article, still part of the same sort of linkage of different literatures and ideas.
Yeah, definitely kind of queer theory and animal studies and their intersections has always kind of been the focus.
So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, I think, I've already mentioned Carol's influence on me just kind of from reading The Sexual Politics of Meat. So I think, and I know she gets mentioned a lot in the podcast. So I thought I'd shout to kind of Professor Jason Edwards. So he was a supervisor of mine during my master's, but a very dear kind of friend now. And it's him who invited me to this whaling conference, which kind of made this paper happen in the first place. And I also have a paper kind of being published on restoration wood carving and kind of looking at animals in that. And that again is his influence. And I think, just in terms of expanding the kind of areas that I look at and things I would never have thought to think about before, he's had a huge influence in that.
Yeah, good. So what do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Well, I think, that is something I hope that we can do something in general. I feel that my strengths as a kind of person, my skill set is in academia, is in academic writing, is in kind of critical thinking and literary analysis, and so I just strive to make that, I guess, doing something right. That I'm using the tools that I have and putting them to the good of animals. So I hope that theory has some kind of trickle down effect, that it shapes kind of cultural feelings, but sometimes one doubts that, right?
Yes, no, I hear you. I mean, I'd like to hope that an article like this one on vegan camp could be picked up by thoughtful vegans who aren't necessarily academics. And if you're right about this as a survival strategy, and I think surely there's something in that, then you'd hope that could be really valuable for lots of individual vegans.
I hope so.
Yeah. I'd hope, for example, that there's a good number of vegans who might know a bit about queer theory and might be quite drawn to this. Mm-hmm. So, here's hoping.
Yeah.
If you had that power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think that would be, I guess, a kind of general sense of violence and cruelty. In that, I think, as this paper attests, and as you mentioned at the end there, it's really this kind of traumatic encounter with just the sheer extent of the kind of violence and suffering that really, that I think really burns my soul in some way, and that I find it very hard to deal with. So I think that is definitely at the heart of what I change.
So what is it you're working on next?
So, I mean, I'm hoping to continue to expand the camp project into kind of, I guess, a broader project on reparative vegan aesthetics. My PhD thesis has been, it will be published as a monograph with Oxford University Press, I hope soon. So that's in process. And just kind of continuing to working on teaching. That takes up most of my time at the moment.
Well, congratulations on the OUP contract. What was the PhD thesis about?
So that's on monstrous vegans. So looking at the last 200 years of Anglophone literature, the repetition and various kind of appearances of vegan monsters.
Well, excellent. That sounds very interesting. I do hope you'll come back to Knowing Animals to talk to us about that on a different occasion.
Oh, if you'll have me, yeah.
And so how can people find out more about your work?
So, I mean, I'm on academia.edu. I have a staff page on the University of Amsterdam website, and my email address is on that. So that's the uva.nl, and you can email me at e.j.quinn@uva.nl. Yeah, I think those are probably the main passages. I'm not a big Twitter person, so.
Well, I hear you. I've only just joined Twitter myself, so it's a new world to me.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Emelia, for what was a really great podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much, Josh.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, which is the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at @aveganphilosopher. And as I just said, I'm new to this world, so I'm looking for lots of interesting people. Yes, please be nice. Also, don't forget to tell others about the podcast and to review us on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.